I promised you a treat, and here's a treat. Yes, Craig Ogilvie. For those of you who know and love him, you know that he is the play guru and everything else guru. He's spoken at the Dog Behavior Conference once before when we were all in person, was so well received. So I've asked him back. And if you guys haven't registered for the conference yet, go to dogbehaviorconference.com. It is a virtual online conference. April the 1st to the 3rd, we will be live, but don't worry if you can't join live for all 3 days. We don't expect you to. As soon as you register and as soon as the presentations go out live, you have access to them for 12 months. So come join us. We have the most incredible presenters, including Craig Ogilvie from Ogilvie Dogs. Welcome.
Hi, hey everyone, you okay? Hi
Yes,
Victoria, nice to see you again.
I'm so glad that you are speaking again. And of course, it's virtual, which is a little strange, but I think at this point, we're all pretty well used to it.
Yeah,
Now,
for sure.
did I read on your website that you are actually doing a lot of virtual consultations?
I still do a lot of, I used to do it before the pandemic, but like
Right.
much more so now. So lots of coaching primarily at the moment, which is sort of feedback on a daily basis, videos back and forth, Zoom calls involved in the packages. So arguably now it's a good 50 to 60% of what I do, superseding all of the in-person stuff really, just because I think everybody's adjusted to it, to be honest with you. It actually works really well, particularly for behavior problems.
Doesn't it
Works really well to
just?
be able to deal with people every single day, and you just keep sort of drip feeding them information, making adjustments and changes as is needed, and it doesn't become so overwhelming for people. You make little changes, get your management protocols into play, little training changes along the way, which works really well. So yeah, I really enjoy it. But as I say, a lot of what I do now is virtual.
Yeah. Now you're going to be talking about interactive toy play from foundations to practical reinforcer,
Mm.
you have a wonderful book out as well, and you are sort of I mean you do a lot of other things, but you are very much known for play and
Yeah,
talk
for
about
sure.
how
Yeah.
important play is. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so like when I first started working with dogs, like I was really, really interested all the way through my childhood. My granddad was a police dog handler when I was a little boy, so I was really sort of captivated by dogs and interested. And I sort of went through my teens very interested, training like our pet dogs at home. My granddad had retired, so from German Shepherds we transferred over to a Labrador, and then my interest was continued as I got into my teens, but decided it best at that point to get a trade because I really didn't know how to get into it as a profession. So I got a trade as a joiner, but also was studying all of the time. And I met one of my very first mentors who was a retired dog behaviorist, worked primarily around London, and really took me under his wing and helped me sort of get my foot in the door, so to speak, with regards to understanding behavior. He would take me to different people that he knew were current professionals. Um, Part of what I did a lot of at that time as well was a big interest in working dogs, because obviously that was where my eyes were on the prize. Behavior modification and working dogs, like the two things I wanted to learn. So I started doing a lot with working dogs, and very, very luckily, through my old mentor, I met like the person that's like my dad now, who really sort of took me under his wing and took me to and from Europe with a sport called Mondio Ring, which
Yeah.
is a sport that consists of obedience, agility, and criminal apprehension. And I learned sort of the art of the decoy, so to speak.
Which is an art. People
Yeah,
just
it is.
think it's
Oh
a
God,
person
yeah,
in a
it's just,
suit, but it
yeah,
is an art to be
yeah,
a good. You can have bad decoys and good decoys, and
yeah, for
good
sure. Like,
decoys don't injure the dog, as in
yeah,
like they know how to catch a dog. They know
yeah.
right. So
And then
sorry, I
also,
had to come in there.
no, that's you're more than
Yeah.
welcome. It's also like the training aspect of it, like for a competition helper. So I got licensed to wear the costume early on, like about 18 months after training. I was the first person in the UK to do so. So I could wear the costume in competitions in Europe, which I did lots of. But the bit that really, really got me was the training of the dogs and developing dogs that weren't quite so confident, which is where the skills for interactive play come from, because the correlation is like really, really clear with regards to when you start off teaching a dog, you're captivating or honing in on the predatory sequence and really focusing on, to begin with, the dog's desire to chase and grab bite. And then from the grab bite, we obviously manipulate the process to get the dog into a position in which they're really comfortable and reinforced by biting onto something that is just a toy to begin with, like a tea towel. And I was obviously doing that. I was obsessed, absolutely obsessed, as I still am, but I was like completely obsessed with it. So I was doing it in every spare hour that I possibly could do. And then as I was working lots of working dogs, I started to use the techniques with all of the pet dogs with behavioural problems that I was working with, because it was sort of like a parallel universe, so to speak. I was doing lots of working dog stuff, studying lots and lots for behaviour, and then doing home visits. And I started to use the techniques with dogs struggling with sort of confidence issues, and then helping people in sports that were outside of the biting remit, which is where I started to systemize what I was doing so I could explain to everybody. I worked around the acronym interactive, which was easy to sort of explain to people. And then it was a bit serendipitous, really. Somebody reached out to me and said, would you be interested in writing a book on the subject? I wrote the book, and then really from there, it just platformed. I met some wonderful people, like Kamal Fernandez is one of my really, really close friends.
Yeah, isn't he great?
Yeah, amazing human being, amazing trainer. And I went to do some seminars for him. And again, he's another cornerstone that I wouldn't be without, because he really gave me sort of the ability to move forward with training and the confidence to do so. And then again, sort of serendipitously enough, I went and did some seminars for the UK Police, Wiltshire Constabulary, some problem solving seminars with sort of the dogs there. And I was offered a full-time position as a trainer by the dog training manager. So I worked as sort of a civilian police dog training instructor for a few years. And then very, very fortunately enough, well, it was fortunately and unfortunately, like the business got so busy that I couldn't do both, because I love training police dogs. Like, it's one of the things that I really, really enjoy.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's such a fantastic job. And obviously the times with my granddad it was really close to the heart. But unfortunately, it was a case of I was having to turn down all of these fantastic opportunities of traveling and teaching internationally and really getting more and more experience. So I stopped working for the police, and then from there it's just been full-time dog training for myself, which is we've been really fortunate. So been able to move to like a nice location and put up the Ogilvie Dogs Training Centre. Me and my wife, she's been fantastic. Like, again, another cornerstone person in my life is my wife. I met her. She's an agility, like a very, very serious competitive
and
agility.
A very good one, yes.
Yeah, very, very good. She's been very, very, she's talented, very fortunate, but very talented, and has been on the Great Britain team several times, competed internationally. And she's, again, another cornerstone in my life, because when we met together, we were able to do things that perhaps wouldn't have been quite so achievable by ourselves. So we were able to get the farm that we live on now and put the Ogilvie Dog Centre up, and just really continue doing what I love for a living. So it's really, really, really lucky. I had a very, very fortunate path.
So, do you know, it's interesting because you have such experience with working dogs, and now such experience with companion dogs. A question that I get asked, and I do not have as much experience with working dogs as you do, but I have had experience working dogs, certainly with the police, for 5 years. Mm-hmm. And actually 7 years it eventually ended up being. And so I learned so much by working with American police here, and by also talking with the Met. And but I learned so much about teaching working dogs. I always get asked the question, is there a difference? So I'm asking you the question, is there a difference working with working dogs and companion dogs? And if so, what is it?
I think the two primary differences are genetic influence on behaviour, which is one of the primary factors. Obviously, there's selective breeding that dictates that the dogs are going to have the attributes that are going to make them more desirable for a working role. And when we think about a companion dog, typically the genetics, or they're going to have the genetic attributes which are going to make them more suited for a pet role. Training fundamentally is reinforcement drives behaviour. So we're going to find the things that the dogs are most reinforced by, capitalise on those, and use operant conditioning to train the behaviours that we want to, with all of our focus on positive reinforcement. So the training process, the actual training, is different because the exercises are completely different. But the actual principle of training, there is no difference. It's exactly the same thing. It's just different behaviours. And typically, like if you're thinking about training a police dog, there's lots and lots of boxes to tick with all of the different exercises that they've got to be able to do. One of the things about a working dog typically is the consistency that we would like to see. Again, there's no such thing as a fully trained dog. That doesn't exist. There's always going to be peaks and troughs and fluctuations in behaviour. But what we're looking to do is to create as much consistency with all of the sequences as is possible, so that the dogs have got a really, really good chance of, performing the activities, the tasks that they need to, as and when they need to. But the actual training, if you think fundamentally about training, you know, some of the basics that I would do with a police dog puppy, are very, very similar than I would do with a pet dog puppy. Free shaping, you know, awareness, like bodily awareness, etc., etc. All of the things that I would do with one puppy would be the same as the next. It's just then we start to sort of take the deviation in the path that we're going to select for them.
So when people see, let's say, in apprehension work, right? When people see a dog biting on a sleeve, or a lot of people go, "Whoa, that dog is aggressive." What do you say to that?
It's, well, the thing with biting is typically it's human nature to go, a dog is biting and it must be aggression orientated. But like my big dog Zen, he's nearly 4 now, and he'll bite anybody that wears a costume. So, but the suit is the antecedent and part of the arrangement that leads the dog into biting. It's slightly different for a police dog because they can't be kit aware. However, the process for Zen, he's as social as you could get a dog. Like if he would just want to cuddle you and lick you to death, like there's no aggression there for him, because the process is effectively of teaching to bite is running through the process of a dog understanding sort of the motivation and having the consistency with regards to biting an item like a tea towel when they're a baby. And then we just follow this generalization process, so to speak, which also involves sort of incremental progression where you build them onto biting the desired bit of equipment. If you're working like a dog that is going to be potentially competing in sports like Zen, you're going to focus on the equipment that they use. So for us, we always use a costume, which is typically made out of a linen-y type material with padding into it. So I would always start off with a jute material and build up once the dog's grip is consistent onto the costume. The same process would be followed with a police dog. The difference being in that set of circumstances is that you would transfer the dog over to being able to bite kit that was completely concealed. So you'd have somebody dressed looking completely normal, but actually they'd have sort of secure or covert padding underneath, which means that when the dog bites, basically it doesn't realize that there's kit on them, and the person isn't going to get a lot of puncture wounds in them unless obviously they've done something extremely dangerous. And again with dog bites as well, from my memory, a dog bite is one down from the use of a firearm. So a person has got to do something, you know, incredibly dangerous, and there's got to be a lot of reason for a policeman sending his dog to bite someone. Yeah. So it's not something that's looked upon, you know, lightly. Oh, you know, we'll just send them off to bite someone. It's something that's really has to be thought about and justified. Like the policemen are then taken off of duty. They've got to justify why the bite happened. They've got to write all of their reports and make sure that it was completely clear. So the aggression aspect isn't true with regards to how you go about teaching a dog to bite, because I've trained biting dogs for all of my adult life now, although now I must admit the focus that I work on is much more with behavioural problems and sort of problems in states for arousal, etc. But, you know, for all of the sports dogs that come to me for training, there is no aggression whatsoever. Like, absolutely, I can bite them in the costume, take the costume off, and every time at the end of the session we sit down and we have a cuddle whilst they've sort of got their toy in their mouth or whatever. And that's the way it is with all of the dogs that I train. So it's a little bit of a misconception, really, on most cases. It
is a misconception.
There's obviously exceptions to that, but in most cases it is a misconception.
There are exceptions to that, and you know, I feel like an absolute gift and something that a lot of civilians don't get. In that, when I was filming Guardians of the Night, that I did spend 5 years learning and going on their calls. So not only did was I able to go to all the training sessions and able to partake in those training sessions and learning how to be a decoy myself, which I don't think I was very good at, but I was able to see it in action. And in fact, what I could say in those 5 years is that as a general rule, cops don't really want to do paperwork, and they're going to do their job, but sending a dog off to actually bite somebody, to actually apprehend somebody, is a last resort. Yes, as well as here in America, the use of a firearm is a very, very last resort, and it needs explaining and it needs documenting. And I don't think people realize that actually everything with those dogs is documented, to the training, to when training happens, to every day. it's documented. And so it's not just about sending a dog off to a bite. It's not just about, teaching a dog to just find and sniff out narcotics and money and other kinds of paraphernalia like that. It is all about documentation. It is a massive job to be a canine handler. And so this sort of leads me on, because of my experience working here in America, not just sort of in that working dog world, obviously, but companion dog world, but seeing so much brutal force.
Yes. With regards to training methods, you mean?
Yeah. And so I'd like to sort of, I know that's something you're not really going to focus on in your talk, but I think it's really important for people, because we do have a lot of sport dog handlers on here on Facebook, and we do have a lot of people that, we also have law enforcement as well. So I'd sort of like you to talk a little bit about the great debate.
Yeah, it's for me, the reason that people typically use tools is because they're in a position in which the training hasn't been clear, consistent, or incremental enough. That's my opinion. Yeah. Like for the big dog Zen, a big dog is only little, but I mean my adult dog Zen, like the release, for example, is one of the things that people struggle with greatly, with
100%.
Dogs to let go. So for me, I take a little bit of a different approach with my dogs. When they're babies, I don't go sort of crash bang wallop, so to speak, into biting somebody in a costume. My focus is primarily building motivation up with toy drive and playing with me. And I also teach the dogs sort of biting, grips, etc. with me, which isn't a common approach. Typically people want to hand over as quickly as is possible. And there's obviously going to be debate, swings and roundabouts with regards to how the dog develops in that manner. But I'm in a position in which if I ask the dog to come here when he's biting a man in a costume, he projectile spits the man out to get back to me as quick as he can, because arguably in that set of circumstances, the reward that he's going to get from me, which would be a fluffy chaser type toy, has sort of a relevant circumstantial value to what he's doing in the costume. Arguably, it's not quite as high, but because I've built up so much reinforcement history with regards to the reinforcer that I'm using with me, it is a really, really solid option. So it's, oh God, I want to get back to dad and I want to be rewarded immediately. And I can, hand on heart, say I've never had him not let go of somebody in a costume ever. And that's all based on his motivation to get back to me. But I've spent a lot of time doing it. So by the time he actually bit somebody in a costume, he was way over a year old, like way over a year old. But all of the motivation had been put into like the toy play with me, but also all of his control behaviors. Like for me, it's very, very important that dogs can alternate between food reinforcement and toy reinforcement.
Yes.
Because typically if the dog's in a position in which they are not able to take food, that they are in a non-adaptive state of arousal, which means, and for a dog like a Malinois, working bred German Shepherd, etc., even high-dry Border Collies, Rottweilers, the list, name the list, even Labradors, they're in a position in which they are so aroused that they can't take food. Food is a primary reinforcer which fulfills a biological need. It could be the case that the toy is more circumstantially valuable in that set of circumstances, but how do we know if we're not in a position in which the dog is able to alternate freely between the two? So often, like when I'm going to do a biting exercise, I'll ask the dog for a random behavior like a touch or a middle or eye contact. And rather than giving him the all clear to go and bite the person, I'll give my reward specific marker on me. I'll go, yep, and I'll flick him the sausage and we go again. So that he's in a position in which it's nice and clear for him. But I think the foundations that you have to put in do take like a good period of time, as any good dog training does. And I would say that people sort of rushing along might be the case that they sort of end up implementing those tools when really we could train the dogs in a different manner. So and everybody has their own opinion, Victoria. Like it's always a great debate. And I'm very much so. I don't get involved in politics or big conversations. I just do what I do and I help the people to the best of my ability that I can do. But all of the dogs that I've trained, particularly the ones that come to me for puppies, they let go. Like they come back. There's no problem. They let go and they're able to do their behaviors in the presence of distractions. But we work on the control obediency behaviors, making those super reinforcers, as well as the sexy stuff, which is ultimately getting the dog to bite the person in the costume. And with a dog with that genetic influence on behavior, the biting's easy, Victoria. How they bite is a different matter. They've got to bite in a particular way, particularly for sports. But getting the dogs to bite, there's generations and generations and generations that dictate that they're going to be strongly gifted with those attributes.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I do think, you know, in America, especially with not so much my handlers, even though they were maybe a little harsher, but than I was used to, but definitely other greener handlers. But things are changing here too. There is a very, very large police dog training school and breeder here, very famous, and they one of the handlers that I knew went up there a couple of years ago before the pandemic, and the meeting at the start, they were like, if you hurt your dog in any way, you have no place here.
Oh, excellent.
What? Wow, amazing. And so I do think it's changing, but I think change isn't easy, and I think it's slow and it takes a while.
In my opinion as well, and what I can see is as we start to get the transition of some of the world's very talented trainers, particularly some of like the European ladies and gentlemen that have come from obedience and getting into sports dog training, the foundations are very, very much so based all around positive reinforcement, because that's all they've ever come up with. So they're not in a position in which they're sort of crossover trainers and they're trying to learn new things. That's all they've ever done. So the remit of the tools isn't inside of their box. So they work and they train the dogs around what they want them to do, using all of the, you know, the suitable reinforcement options, which is nice to see. I do think the world is changing, and it's just that there's always going to be camps, isn't there, Victoria? Like, and I'm always in a position in which, as I say, I just try to go, this is how I would go about doing that, and I help people as absolutely best I can using the methods that I know work best.
Yeah, well, of course, play being a very important part for our companion dogs as well. And,
yes, absolutely.
And I feel like it's still, I mean, we are putting more emphasis on it, but I still think it needs to be highlighted more about how important and how effective it is. And one of the things I know you're going to be talking about are getting dogs interested in play. Now, I work with a lot of rescue dogs here, a lot of dogs that come from incredibly bad situations. They have no idea what play is all about because they never learned. Could you talk about how would you get a dog interested in play?
Typically for me, what I like to do, particularly when I speak to the person or the caregiver of the dog, if they've got a sort of a learning history with the dog, so to speak, meaning they've had them for some time, some of the typical questions that I'll ask is, what are the dog's interests like in the evenings at home? Particularly for a dog that's new in a household, you're going to get that frantic random activity period that happens typically between 7 and 9 o'clock somewheres, depending on the dog's sort of sleeping patterns, where they become more aroused. And a lot of the problem behaviors that we see during that time often give us an inclination of what the dog actually likes to do, particularly toy wise. So perhaps they go on a zoomie around the living room and they grab that fluffy cushion that's on the sofa that they really shouldn't grab because mum and dad don't want them to, but they haven't managed it or taught them an alternative. So that's what they do. So if they say, oh, that's what they do during this period, for me, I'm looking for informations and snippets as to what the dog is interested in, what type of materials they might be interested in. But then I'll also ask questions revolving around chasing. So typically, a large percentage of the dogs that I've worked with, which has got into the thousands now, have got an interest in some type of chasing or holding something in their mouth. There's going to be one of the two. So I try to gather that information off of the person. If they say, oh, you know, they've got quite a strong predatory drive, or they steal that cushion off of the sofa, I'm looking really to work around getting the dog interested in an item, which is going to be ultimately the bridge for play, using absolutely no pressure. One of the things with toy play, if we was to ask sort of a handful of pet dog owners with very limited experience with dogs, if we were to say, oh, get your dog to play, the first thing they do is like wiggle the toy in the dog's face and go, come on, get it. And for some dogs that are very sort of gifted with regards to genetics and their desire leaning towards that predatory sequence and wanting to chase and grab bite things, they'll grip onto it with no problem whatsoever. But I've seen hundreds and hundreds of dogs where the person gets the toy out and the dog goes, oh God, like I need to get out of it now because this is going to be bad. So I very much work on selecting an array of items that, based on the history that I've got from the dog, but also intuition with regards to working with lots of dogs, that they might be interested in. And I do something that I call like the choice to chase test, whereas I basically just gather information on which toy the dog is most interested in chasing after. Once I've got that, so if I've worked through sort of 3 or 4 items, the dog usually comes up with a jackpot. The jackpot is the one that we're going to stick with. And basically what I do is develop play from there, building into sort of being able to attach an extension to that toy, getting the dog to be able to chase it whilst it's attached to the handler, not biting them in the hands, but actually targeting the lure part of the toy, and then building into the process from there.
Sorry, that's my computer. It's incredibly effective. It's incredibly effective. And I mean, just watching a lot of your work, it truly is. It's wonderful to see dogs having fun. And that's basically what training should all be about, shouldn't it? I mean,
if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong.
Exactly. And learning skills, because, you know, obviously they're living in our environments, aren't they? So that we have to teach them how to live in this strange world that we inhabit. Because at the end of the day, they are dogs with very large teeth. I mean, I have a shih tzu here with very large teeth.
I think a lot of the time as well, people overlook how organic it is for a dog to use their mouth in social interactions, tactile contact, etc. So like a lot of the problem behavior dogs that I work with are bull breeds, and you know, the people come along and they say, oh, you know, they're 16, 17, 18 weeks or 6 months, however old they are, and they just won't stop like biting and mouthing. And you know, it can get really, really serious. We don't want it to get really serious, but they're not thinking typically. All people tend to think is, how do I stop them doing that, rather than what can I get them to do instead, which is just the, you know, the very basic principle of alternatively reinforcing behaviors. And typically, if we can teach the dog and give them an outlet for this desire to bite onto things, and then teach lots of desirable control behaviors around that, but you're facilitating the dog's need, but you're also facilitating your requirement, usually for some type of safety, to be able to have the dog follow instruction willingly during that period of time, which is something, you know, still to this day, Victoria, like I do lots of different things, primarily based around problem behaviors at this point in my life. But the principles of introduction to play are so beneficial with the array, from sports dogs to somebody that's, you know, just retired and they've got their first dog from a rescue centre, and they want to build like a really solid relationship, understand what reinforcement is, how they can use it sort of favourably to get alternative behaviours when they're out and about, build their relationship, etc. It's, for me, it's something that's really, really important and continues to be, you know, for a vast array of the different dogs that I work with.
Craig, this is the reason why you come back to present again, because you're so amazing, and I know you've got some great information to share with attendees. So guys, if you want to listen to Craig's presentation, register for the Dog Behavior Conference, April the 1st to the 3rd. It's online, doesn't matter where you are in the world. You can join us and hear more of what Craig has to say. So really excellent tips and advice for dog lovers everywhere. And again, doesn't matter if you're a veterinarian, a regular just dog geek, a trainer, groomer, this conference is for you. So Craig, where do people find out more about you? And if they are lucky to live near Bourne, they could come to the centre, but where can they find more about you?
So the website is ogilviedogs.com, and then the easiest page to get hold of me is Craig Ogilvie Dogs on Instagram. So either of those platforms, also at Ogilvie Dogs on Facebook. But any of those, you're more than welcome to have a look. We've got lots of details on the website. You can reach out to me via email, or alternatively drop us a DM on Instagram.
Thank you so much. We will see you at the conference.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Have a lovely day.